They stood ankle-deep in flooded rice fields, opening sacks full of live snakes. To outsiders, it looked insane. Headlines mocked it. Commenters laughed. But months later, the rats were gone, and the rice was thriving. Now the world is taking notes. This is the story of how China's strangest pest control plan actually worked. Why did they do it? To understand why China decided to release snakes into its rice fields, you first have to understand the size of the problem they were facing. The rats were completely out of control. In provinces like Guangxi and Guangdong, regions that produce millions of tons of rice each year, rodents were wiping out harvests on a massive scale. Farmers reported entire plots being eaten overnight. The rats destroyed stalks, ate grains before they matured, and caused structural damage to the fields by digging tunnels under the embankments. Irrigation systems were being chewed through, and storage areas were constantly raided. Some farms were losing over half their yield to rodent damage, and for small-scale farmers, that meant financial ruin. The government had already tried traditional solutions. Farmers used poison, but after years of exposure, many rats had developed resistance. Baits and traps worked only in small areas and couldn't keep up with the rate at which the rodents were breeding. Experts estimated that, in some zones, there were more than 100 rats per hectare, a number that meant they were reproducing faster than any pest control effort could contain. People even tried bringing in more cats and dogs to chase them off, but that made little difference. Rodents are quick, adaptable, and able to nest in hard-to-reach places. The pests were simply too many, too clever, and too fast. At this point, agricultural officials began looking for a longer-term solution, something that didn't rely on chemicals or mechanical traps. That's when the idea of using snakes returned to the conversation. Historically, snakes have always played a key role in rural Chinese ecosystems, especially in the south. Farmers used to say that if you saw snakes in your field, it meant the land was healthy. The snakes ate rats, frogs, and insects, helping to maintain a natural balance. In the past, they were considered part of the ecosystem until widespread pesticide use and urban expansion reduced their numbers. Instead of fighting nature with chemicals and traps, Chinese authorities made a bold decision to recruit nature as an ally. They began by identifying predator species already native to the region, ones that posed no danger to humans but had a proven appetite for rats. After careful ecological assessments, two snakes stood out: the oriental rat snake and the checkered keelback. Both were non-venomous, common in parts of rural China, and perfectly adapted to wet, marshy environments. These snakes could swim long distances, strike with lightning speed, and consume rodents whole, sometimes devouring several in a single day. Crucially, they showed no interest in humans and were generally shy, preferring to flee rather than fight when approached. To make this strategy work at scale, the government turned to controlled breeding. Specialized snake farms were set up and regulated, where large populations of these two species were raised under constant health monitoring. Veterinarians and conservation experts screened the snakes for parasites, illnesses, or genetic issues to prevent any risk of ecological disruption. Only the healthiest specimens were approved for release. Once cleared, the snakes were deployed in massive numbers directly into the flooded rice fields. These fields, already filled with water to nurture young rice shoots, became the perfect terrain for the snakes to operate. Rats that once thrived by burrowing and hiding among dry ridges were now exposed. With fewer places to run, they became easy prey. The snakes moved silently through the shallow water, turning each rice paddy into a deadly trap for any rodent unlucky enough to remain. To outsiders, the entire scene looked strange, even alarming. Videos of workers dumping sacks full of snakes into muddy fields made headlines around the world. But for the officials running the program, the goal wasn't shock, it was survival. The rat infestations weren't just damaging crops, they were threatening food security for entire regions. This wasn't about creating chaos. It was about restoring the natural chain of control, bringing back a predator that had been pushed out by human activity. The world finds out. The plan didn't stay secret for long. Within days of the first snake release, footage began surfacing online. Curious farmers, many of whom had never seen such large-scale releases of reptiles, recorded what they were witnessing. Videos showed clusters of snakes slithering across narrow dikes, swimming through shallow water, and weaving silently between rice stalks. Some clips showed sacks being emptied into irrigation ditches, releasing dozens of snakes at once. The imagery was so surreal, it spread fast. First through Chinese social media platforms like Weibo and Douyin, then spilling over to global platforms like X, formerly Twitter. Within hours, hashtags like #SnakeFlood, #ChinaSnakePlan, and even #SerpentSolution began trending. The international reaction was immediate and intense. People across the world were either fascinated, disturbed, or downright amused. Western media outlets jumped on the story almost instantly. Some described it as a nightmare disguised as agriculture, while others questioned the long-term ecological impact. Late-night comedians in the US and Europe poked fun at the idea, comparing it to a low-budget horror movie, or suggesting that China had unlocked a new level of pest control insanity. The response from the professional world wasn't much more forgiving. Pest control specialists in the US, UK, and Australia raised serious concerns. One American researcher, who specialized in urban rodent behavior, told journalists, "This sounds less like pest control and more like a biological gamble. You don't control chaos with more chaos." The quote spread like wildfire and was used repeatedly by critics to mock the entire effort. Others raised valid points about the risks. What if the snakes disrupted native species? What if they introduced new parasites or diseases? What if they started breeding uncontrollably? Ecologists and conservationists outside China also raised alarms. Some warned that certain non-target animals, like frogs, birds, or even domestic pets, might be attacked or outcompeted. Others questioned whether releasing that many predators into human-altered farmland could backfire over time. With social media amplifying every concern, what started as a regional agricultural measure had suddenly become a global controversy. Yet, despite all the noise, the Chinese government didn't back down. Instead of scaling back, they doubled down. Provincial authorities confirmed that new regions, especially parts of Jiangxi, Hunan, and even sections of Yunnan, were preparing to adopt the same snake-based control strategy. Officials explained that this wasn't some reckless experiment. Years of data had shown that rat populations were becoming immune to poisons and immune to scare tactics. Traps and predators weren't working. They needed to try something different. And this time, they were using a species that had always existed in harmony with the local ecosystem. More quietly, reports from the fields began to change the tone. Farmers in pilot zones started noticing something they hadn't seen in months: rice crops that weren't shredded overnight, irrigation ditches that weren't clogged with tunnels, storage huts that weren't overrun. Some even reported seeing fewer snakes than expected, not because the plan failed, but because the snakes were doing their job and moving discreetly. To many of these rural farmers, the reaction from the outside world felt like a joke. They weren't trying to scare anyone. They were trying to survive. And for the first time in years, it seemed like they finally had a fighting chance. What happened next? For the first few weeks after the snake release, doubts hung heavy in the air. Night after night, rats still tore through the young rice shoots, chewing the roots, shredding leaves, and leaving muddy trails of destruction. Farmers who had suffered years of crop loss saw little change and feared the worst, that this was just another failed government experiment. In some areas, workers refused to enter flooded fields, afraid of stepping on hidden snakes curled under the water. In others, the reptiles were blamed for disrupting irrigation channels by nesting in the narrow trenches. Complaints piled up. On social media, users debated whether the situation was getting better or worse. But then something shifted, quietly at first. Rats that once roamed freely across paddies became harder to spot. The nightly chewing, once so loud it kept some villagers awake, began to fade. By morning, there were fewer gnawed stalks, fewer droppings, fewer telltale signs of infestation. Fields that once echoed with scurrying noises after dusk were now strangely still. Farmers started whispering that maybe, just maybe, the snakes were working. After a while, those whispers turned into confident statements. In districts across Guangxi, Guangdong, and parts of Jiangxi, agricultural offices began recording a sudden drop in rodent sightings. In some villages, traps once overflowing with rats were now empty. In others, farmers reported going days without seeing a single one. Entire paddies, once written off as lost causes, were now bouncing back. The plants, free from constant nibbling, shot up tall and green. And with them, the farmers' moods changed too. Skepticism gave way to relief and even pride. In October, the breakthrough became measurable. Data from the Jiangmen district showed around 20% increase in rice yields compared to the previous year. In nearby Yunfu and Shaoguan, similar patterns emerged. These weren't isolated successes. Across multiple counties, harvest numbers soared. Crops that were once half-eaten or flattened now stood tall and unblemished. A program that many had dismissed as reckless or even absurd was now being studied as a model. Farmers who once mocked the idea admitted they were wrong. Some even joked that the snakes had done what pesticides and poison never could: win a silent war. Even more surprising was what happened to the snakes. Fears of a runaway population never materialized. Instead, nature responded. Egrets, herons, and other native water birds began feeding on the snakes in the shallows. Wild boars from the surrounding forests rooted out their nests along the dikes. Raptors and monitor lizards, missing for years, returned to the rebalanced fields. It was as if the introduction of the snakes had jump-started a chain reaction. One by one, old players in the ecosystem returned, each one keeping the next in check. A local ecologist described it as a biopulse, a burst of natural correction after decades of imbalance. By using predators instead of poison, the region had avoided chemical runoff, soil damage, and the endless cycle of resistance that usually follows pesticide use. The snakes had come in, done their job, and then slotted into the wider web of life without tipping the scale. There were no mass snake attacks, no mass rat resurgence, just quiet, stable recovery. Now everyone's copying it. The success of the program quickly caught international attention. By early 2024, China's unusual method of pest control was no longer just a local experiment. It had become a global topic of interest. Agricultural ministries across Asia and Africa took notice, especially countries facing similar problems with rice and maize crops. Vietnam was among the first to act. The Mekong Delta, known as the country's rice bowl, had been losing tens of millions of dollars each year to rat damage. Rats chewed through irrigation channels, ruined entire sections of harvests, and reproduced faster than local farmers could fight them. With few predators in the fields and growing resistance to rodenticides, authorities in southern Vietnam reached out to Chinese officials for help. What followed was a serious exchange: visits from agricultural experts, footage from Chinese test sites, and detailed reports on how snakes were raised, selected, and released. Vietnam's solution didn't involve importing snakes from China. Instead, Researchers at Kantho University and local agricultural agencies focused on native predators already living in the Mekong Delta. So, instead of flooding fields with predators, researchers launched carefully controlled pilot programs. Snakes were introduced in small, enclosed test plots, where their impact could be monitored without risk of disrupting other species. Each site was tracked for months. Rat population counts, crop damage reports, and even biodiversity surveys were logged. The results were immediate and surprising. As the snakes settled in, rat numbers dropped sharply, often by more than 60% in the first season. Crop yields rose, and something else happened. Birds, frogs, and dragonflies, previously wiped out by chemical poisons, started to return. Farmers who had spent years spraying toxic bait noticed that fields became more alive. Pest control was happening, but without side effects. Soon, word spread. Farmers in neighboring districts began asking for help, setting up their own snake zones. India followed with its own version of the experiment. In Bihar, one of the country's top rice-producing states, and also one of the hardest hit by rodent infestations, the government was desperate for alternatives. Chemical poisons weren't working anymore, rats were adapting, and entire harvests were still being lost. So local agricultural boards, in partnership with wildlife departments, launched a targeted initiative. The Indian rat snake, already well known in rural areas, became the centerpiece. But unlike the chaotic and often unsupervised snake releases of the past, this time things were different. Snakes were released only into small, government-owned trial farms, where teams of researchers and forest officers could monitor the results. For the first time, educational outreach became part of the rollout. Printed leaflets, posters on village walls, short awareness videos, and even traveling school programs explained how these snakes operated, what they ate, and why they weren't a threat to humans. Initial reactions were mixed. In some villages, panic spread at the mere sight of a snake, while in others, curiosity took over. Many older farmers remembered the days before widespread pesticide use, when snakes were common and rat problems weren't nearly as bad. Over time, something shifted. As rat sightings dropped, villagers began noticing the change, not just in their fields, but in their mindset. Reports of chewed seedlings and burrowed irrigation ditches dropped sharply, and in all the trial plots, not a single snake bite was recorded. The snakes didn't attack, they just hunted. Meanwhile, in Africa, the story took a different shape. In countries like Kenya and Uganda, where maize fields constantly face rodent destruction, the pressure wasn't just economic, it was existential. Many of these smallholder farmers couldn't afford chemical pesticides in the first place, and when rats swarmed, the losses were devastating. That's when local NGOs and wildlife conservation groups stepped in. Funded by international partners, they began testing a new kind of pest control rooted in ecology, not chemistry. Rather than importing anything, they focused on native species like the African house snake and the brown sand snake, both non-venomous and already present in the region. But this wasn't just about releasing snakes. Entire mini ecosystems were designed to support the natural food chain. Buffer vegetation was planted around farms to create hiding spots and passageways for snakes. Nesting trees were restored to attract predatory birds, such as owls and hawks, to further increase pressure on the rat population. The results came faster than expected. In one Ugandan village, rat damage in trial fields dropped by over 60% in just 6 months. Farmers who once viewed snakes with suspicion began calling them field helpers. It wasn't a miracle cure, but it was proof that working with nature, even the scariest parts of it, could be far more effective than working against it. What made all these efforts unique wasn't that countries copied China exactly. They didn't. Every program was tailored to local geography, wildlife, and community habits. No foreign species were introduced. No large-scale releases happened without ecological review. Scientists were part of every step, from measuring rodent populations to tracking how snakes moved once released. Rather than rushing toward a miracle fix, each country focused on slow, cautious adaptation. What emerged was a quiet but powerful shift in thinking. For decades, pest control had meant chemicals, traps, or expensive machinery. But this time, the change was biological and, surprisingly, low-tech. It relied on a deep understanding of local ecosystems, on patience, and on trust that nature, if given the right support, could handle what man-made solutions had failed to fix. The hidden costs. But not everyone is happy about using snakes to control rats. As more countries start trying this method, new concerns are coming up, especially from scientists and health experts. One of the biggest fears is that, in some places, the snakes might reproduce too fast. This can happen in regions where their natural enemies, like eagles, owls, wild boars, or monitor lizards, aren't around to keep the snake population in check. Without these predators, the snakes could multiply and take over the area, creating a new kind of problem instead of solving the old one. There's also the issue of human safety. In many rice farming communities, people often walk barefoot or wade through water in the fields. Even if the snakes released are not venomous, their sudden presence can still cause accidents. Some people have been bitten, not fatally, but enough to cause swelling or infection. In other cases, panic has led to people slipping or hurting themselves while trying to avoid a snake. Some farmers say that while they're happy the rats are gone, they now feel uneasy or nervous walking through their own land. Another challenge is cultural beliefs. In parts of India, Africa, and Southeast Asia, snakes are deeply connected to religion and tradition. Some people see snakes as sacred, linked to gods or ancestors, while others think they bring bad luck or represent evil spirits. In these regions, fear of snakes runs deep, and it's not always about danger. It's about stories passed down for generations. So when governments started releasing snakes into the fields, it wasn't just a scientific decision, it was a cultural shock. In some villages, elders refused to let their land be used, saying it went against tradition. In others, people worried that killing or disturbing a snake might bring curses. Government workers and scientists tried to address this with education campaigns, hosting open meetings, distributing flyers, and using local religious leaders to explain the purpose. In some places, it helped ease concerns, but in others, resistance stayed strong. The emotional reaction to snakes is hard to erase with facts. There have also been real side effects in the environment. In Jiangxi Province, China, people reported that snake nests began appearing closer to homes, wells, and even near schools. This sparked new fears, especially among parents of small children. Some communities began laying traps or burning grass to keep snakes away from their homes. Elsewhere, conservationists noticed ripple effects. In one area, mongoose populations started to decline. These mammals also hunt rats, but are more visible and active during the day. Experts think they may have been pushed out by the snakes, either due to competition for food or simply because they began avoiding snake-dense zones. The balance was shifting. Although it hasn't been proven by long-term studies yet, it shows how solving one problem can sometimes create others. In nature, every action has a chain reaction, and the outcome isn't always what people expect. Still, despite all the problems and warnings, one thing is clear, that the rats are gone. That fact alone has many governments paying close attention. In places where pesticides have become less effective and caused too much environmental damage, leaders are desperate for new ideas. For them, using nature to fight nature feels like a smart next step. The real challenge now isn't whether it works, but how to make sure it works without causing new damage. And with every new project, more is being learned. Ecologists are studying how to release the right number of snakes, how to monitor their spread, and how to support local predator species to prevent overpopulation. These steps are helping turn an experimental idea into a safer, more balanced system. The world is starting to ask a bigger question. In a time where machines and chemicals have dominated farming, is the best solution one that's been in nature all along?